How are national parks created? Who's responsible for the maintenance and care of these areas? And what can the history of these lands teach us about conservation and preservation? We'll answer all of these questions and more on this edition of Getting Schooled. I'm Abby Hornacek. In 2019, the National Park Service recorded over 327 million recreational visits to U.S. national parks. That number of visits is nearly the same as the number of people living in the United States. That is a whole lot of visits, and it just speaks to the wonders our country has to offer. According to that same report, quote, the National Park Service administers more than 400 national parks across the country of different shapes, sizes, and purposes. Now, anyone who has tuned into the last 3 seasons of my Fox Nation show Parked probably knows that national parks and nature are extreme passions of mine. I've had the pleasure of touring some of the most breathtaking and stunning natural wonders our country has to offer. And for season 4, I actually decided to hop in an RV for 12 days with my parents, by the way, and tour 5 national parks and the surrounding land around the Southwest. So I thought now would be the perfect time to chat with the top person responsible for our nation's lands. On this special episode of Getting Schooled, I'm joined by the Secretary of the Interior, David Bernhardt. According to the Department of the Interior, quote, Secretary Bernhardt serves as the 53rd Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior. As Secretary of the Interior, Bernhardt leads an agency with more than 70,000 employees who are stewards for 20% of the nation's lands, including national parks, monuments, wildlife refuges, and other public lands. Secretary Bernhardt, thank you so much for joining this podcast. We are very excited to have you.
Well, it's fantastic to be here.
Look, Secretary, I get to talk about national parks for a living, so I definitely have a dream job, but Secretary of the Interior, you might come in a close second.
Well, it absolutely is a phenomenal responsibility and opportunity to serve the public on a level that is so consequential, because I believe, particularly now with people dealing with the results of the pandemic and other things, there's nothing better for America, for our soul, than getting outside, spending time, having an opportunity for respite, having an opportunity for solace, and having an opportunity for rejuvenation. And we also have incredible employees that are incredibly dedicated, that have done an absolutely phenomenal job. And now they're out welcoming people to America's parks, America's wildlife refuges, and throughout our public lands.
I could not agree more that nature and national parks in particular feed the soul. So I guess my question to you is, what got you into national parks? What made you realize that this is something that really can feed your soul?
Well, I grew up in a small rural community in Western Colorado. And that community was surrounded by federal lands. And so really, from the time I was very little, those federal lands meant a great deal to me. They meant opportunities for recreation. They were the places that memories were built. And they also provided great opportunities for education. And anytime, particularly if I go back to my childhood, anytime I had an opportunity to go to a national park, I was inspired. I was inspired to learn more about the issues that were raised. My first national park that I can remember was a trip to Mesa Verde, and that opened up an entire history to me of a people that I was not familiar with, questions about why did they leave, and that stimulated me to study and read and think about. And those are great moments. My wife and I got married right outside of Estes Park, right outside of the Rocky Mountain National Park.
Wow.
And so these places hold great meaning to me personally. And given how important they have been, I think it's incredible to have the opportunity to hopefully be providing that same type of inspiration to those who are visiting the places today.
That must have been a beautiful wedding. I would love to see photos of that eventually. So I was telling you earlier, we're going on this 12-day RV trip with my parents for my Fox Nation show Parked, and you mentioned Mesa Verde. We're actually ending there. We haven't been there yet. Is there anything we need to see?
Well, I don't know if they still let you do it, but you ought to go climb into a kiva, have them put the top on it, and just sit there and think where you're sitting, others sat before you. It's a phenomenal experience.
A lot of really rich history at Mesa Verde National Park. So I'm excited for that. I'm going to try to do that. Hopefully it's open. We'll see when we get there. All right, let's start with this, Secretary. What's your favorite thing about national parks as someone who is responsible for the management and conservation of most of our federal land and natural resources?
Well, the favorite thing I would say is, look, the mission of the Park Service is to preserve these resources for future generations and provide for the use and enjoyment of the people of those same resources. And what that means is that to the extent that these great resources are available, they need to remain accessible. And that, to me, is really the beauty of the act. I mean, at the end of the day, many have said before me that the national parks were America's best idea. And there is truth to that. And, to be able to go stand where Theodore Roosevelt stood and looked at Yellowstone or wherever you might go, there are moments of inspiration. And the reality is that, as you walk away from there, that your grandchildren can come back and look at that exact same vista. And that is something that's very, very special.
So I guess a big question I have for you is, each park obviously has its own unique history, but generally speaking, how are the boundaries and acreage decided?
Well, the wonderful thing about the Park Service and all our public land is ultimately all of this land is the American people's property. And so we take our direction on how to manage specific areas of land from one place, and that is the United States Congress. Congress gives direction to us. And for example, in Interior, we manage national parks. We also manage U.S. Fish and Wildlife refuges. And then we manage land through the Bureau of Land Management that are public domain lands. And for each of those lands that Congress designated, we have a specific regulatory regime that laws that we must comply with. And so if somebody wants to change those things, if they're outside of our own discretion, they can go to Congress and do that. And so that is precisely how the boundaries of the park at any very significant level would be modified. Same with what the utilization of the particular land is for. And then once Congress has picked what that land is targeted for, we go through an extensive planning process where there's lots of opportunity for people to express their views. And a lot of things take place on our public lands. Grazing activities for cattle, recreational activities, every recreational activity you can imagine. And at the same time, energy development and natural resources development on certain lands. And then some, Congress has specifically designated wilderness, and those are areas that really man will never travel in. And so Congress makes that choice, and that's very appropriate. Congress and the president make a determination as to what the legal regime should be, and then our task is to manage within the context of that legal regime.
So I know that some national parks start out as monuments. Can you just say a little more about the process and how actually establishing an area as a national park unfolds?
Some started as national monuments because the Antiquities Act predated the National Parks Organic Act. So some facilities were designated monuments, and then they became parks after Congress passed the Park Act, and they designated. Others start out as monuments, and And over time, Congress decides that it's worthy of becoming a park. I don't know if you'll be going quite that far north on your trip, but the Black Canyon National Park would be a great example of something that in the 30s was designated a national monument. The local community at the time wanted it to be a national park. And virtually, I think in the late 90s or the early 2000s, Congress enacted the legislation. So it can take a while for these things to become parks if that's what Congress wants to do. And some can happen very, very quickly. And so
for the rest of this podcast and for brand new episodes of Getting Schooled each Monday, head to foxnewspodcast.com.